Thank you, and thank you for dedicating the time to watch this video. My name is Alexander Azadgan, Senior Geopolitical Analyst with Press TV, TRT World, and Katehon, and geopolitical think tanks in Russia, as well as the Professor of Strategic Global Management and International Economy. We had three questions by a student in Australia, and the caliber of these questions, when I get questions like this from my contacts, and the question is of high caliber and really deserves a video response. And then we go ahead and make these videos, and so others could benefit from our answers. Her question had three parts, and I'm going to try to either answer each question in one video or answer all three questions in one comprehensive video. Let's just see how it goes. Let's see how much energy I dedicate to each of these three questions. One thing I've noticed with YouTube, a lot of YouTube viewers don't like videos more than 5 or 6 minutes max. The shorter the better, because nowadays people have shorter attention span. But in our line of work in academia and the think tank circles, we really go into details, with questions and with inquiries and our lectures. So, forgive me if my responses are extensive. I think it's doing something an injustice if you oversimplify it or if you make it too short. In the business world, on the other hand, it's exactly the opposite. CEOs they like short answers, they like executive summaries, and I can do it in that sense as well. At any rate, all these questions are about what's happening in Qatar and the geopolitical ramifications of it when it comes to Iran, and also the pipeline, the two competing pipelines that I talked about in our last video. So a lot of people don't even know this information. This is something that's widely available in the Ministry of Energy across the Middle East. I just not too long ago I finished the comprehensive. I wrote a comprehensive article in the Iranian Mash'al news magazine, which is the Ministry of Petroleum's, I believe, monthly publication. And we got a lot of good reviews on that article, but the pipeline itself was nothing new. So it appears to me that this information is something that's new to people in the West, but if you're actually in the Middle East and you're involved with ministry or departments of energy in these countries, this is widely acknowledged information. So we are talking about these two competing pipelines. We're talking about the Iran-Lebanon pipeline. Let's just call it that. It goes by other names as well. The Islamic pipeline. I think I read it somewhere. So we have that pipeline that is basically a means of exporting Iran's tremendous amounts of natural gas all the way to the Mediterranean. We have a competing Arab pipeline, Arab in terms of Sunni Wahhabi pipeline, that basically is called the Qatar-Turkey pipeline, and that one goes through, it basically goes south from Qatar itself, because Qatar's the natural gas resources are under the Persian Gulf. It's called the North Field, the something. North Shore, or I have the name here, I don't recall it. And that one basically goes, so it will go through Qatar, the peninsula, into northern Saudi Arabia, and then from Saudi Arabia, it basically goes across the northern border of Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and then it goes to Jordan. From Jordan, it was supposed to go to Syria. From Syria, it was supposed to go to Turkey, and then it goes through northwest Turkey, right through I don't know if it's underneath it, or I don't know how they were going to transport it, but it would go to the European part of Turkey, which is just a very small piece of land, and then from there through Bulgaria and all these Eastern European countries, and right into France and Germany, who are two of the biggest consumers of natural gas. So these two pipelines, the competition, at least the way the Saudis and the Qataris, they always see things as a zero-sum game. Either they have to win and somebody else has to lose. They don't have an understanding of a win-win, which is something the Iranians are obviously very good at. So when all this talk was happening, between the Iranians having their own pipeline with the Iraqis, the Syrians, and the Lebanese, the Saudis, and also Qataris. We have to be fair here. The Qatar seems to be on the right side of history right now, but up to now they were playing a very corrosive role. The Qataris, they wanted to have their own natural gas, and they weren't willing to share the European market with the Iranians, and that caused all these problems. That caused the creation of ISIS. That caused, or at least the geosectarian, this Shia Sunni, lunatic the conflict was touched upon. It was like the House of Cards, and then on top of that, you had the discovery of natural gas in Eastern Mediterranean, which made the whole thing even more complex because now all of a sudden Syria wants to have its own say in natural gas under the Mediterranean in their territorial waters, and so did Lebanon, and obviously Israel. Israel is the only country that's excavating that natural gas off of the Eastern Mediterranean, which falls in their territorial maritime borders. I was on TRT, the channel, not too long ago, and it was like as if the sun had risen. When I talked about this, even the host of the program, and this is a global channel, you would think this journalist would be well informed. But, I don't think she was actually being dishonest, but even she implied that this is new information. Whereas if you go in the Middle East, you have access to prestigious think tanks and also Ministry of Energy or the Department of Energy, whatever it's called in those countries. This is common information. At any rate, Israel is the only country that is really taking advantage of all the chaos in Syria and Iraq, and now between Qatar and all these other GCC countries. And it's been a country that's been truly excavating natural gas. Of course, we believe that whole country is illegal, the Zionist entity. We don't even recognize that country as a legitimate, nation. This is a Rothschild-created country. It's Rothschild financed, Rothschild organized, and Rothschild implemented in the 1920s, and then finally in 1948 it became a country because of the Rothschild tremendous influence at the United Nations. So at any rate, here you have in a country that is totally illegitimate in the eyes of all these other Middle Eastern countries, and it's the only country that's actually excavating natural gas off of Mediterranean. So that's its own angle. That's different than the Qatar-Iranian natural gas field, which is huge. But from what we are hearing, this huge gas field in the Eastern Mediterranean is even gonna dwarf the one in Iran. The one that's shared between Iran and Qatar. So Israel is and one of the biggest fields there that's been excavated, and a very advanced technology that U.S. gave actually to the Qataris. I believe they either gave it to the Israelis or the Israelis themselves. Came up with another technology similar to fracking, but going deep sea, deep under the ocean, and excavating tremendous amounts of oil or natural gas. So that's what the Israelis have been doing. The biggest one is called Leviathan. Interestingly, names are so symbolic, but that's what it's called. And the Israelis are actually excavating huge amounts of natural gas. And if they become successful in claiming more of these natural gas fields under the Mediterranean, they could become one of the largest producers of natural gas in the world. So that's how huge the implications of this thing are. And of course, everybody who knows anything about energy or energy sources, clean energy, fossil fuel, knows this particular fact that natural gas is the transition form of energy between petroleum or oil, as we call it in the West, and the clean energy, which hopefully we will all transition into in the years and decades to come. And that would be solar energy, wind, wave energy, all these excellent sources of energy that would make fossil fuel an obsolete source of energy, or at best it would be used for petrochemical products. Everything that we use around us is practically made out of plastic, and that's a derivative of oil. So in the future, we will have more of these things, and we will come to a point of evolution where we would stop burning this very valuable natural resource and then sending CO2 in that in the atmosphere, and instead make all these products. That's the petrochemical side of the oil industry. At any rate, before I actually go into that particular question by our wonderful student in Australia, her question was, which of these pipes has more length And she says, I couldn't find technical information about the Qatar pipeline. Of course, you wouldn't be able to. This is it's been a closely guarded secret except that it's no longer a secret in the circles that we are in. So as far as the length of that pipeline, just to answer that really quickly, it looks like we have to go to a second and a third video. This one is already like 10 minutes. As far as that one, when it came to the actual infrastructure, which would be the pipelines, the so-called Islamic pipeline, which is Iran-Lebanon pipeline that goes through, obviously, through Iraq and Syria, that is a shorter, when it comes to distance and amount of, I don't know, steel that it needs to create these pipes, that one is shorter. However, in the long term, that one is not efficient because what happens with the Iranian pipeline is that it will go to, at the max, it will go to northern Lebanon, and from Lebanon, you have to ship it literally using these gigantic tankers, liquefied natural gas, LNG. And so that's the way. That would be, in the short term, there would be some cost saving. In the long term, however, the pipeline from Qatar that goes through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Syria and Turkey, which is known as the Qatar-Turkey pipeline, in the short term is very expensive because laying down the infrastructure and then ensuring the infrastructure through some of these very unstable countries. At the moment, unfortunately, it's only Syria. That this is a non-starter, and that's what the Qataris are actually realizing right now, that this is not going to work because basically they can't win in Syria. Syria is holding, and a big part of that plan was to go straight through Syria into Turkey in order to take it all the way and connect it to the natural gas pipelines that already exist in Europe. Think of this as the good old-fashioned railroad. You still need to have the railroad infrastructure in your country in order for a train in your country to be connected to the railroad, for example, system in Europe, even if it's all the way from China, because that's one large, landmass. So from that perspective, the Qatari pipeline in the long term would have been more cost efficient, especially as more of that market would go to the Qataris instead of the Iranians and even the Russians, who have been supplying natural gas all these years to Europe. But the Europeans are wary of that, of relying too much on Russia. Russia, every time there was a problem, Russia used its natural gas supply chain as a threat. And a few years ago, this actually happened, and the Russians were not sending natural gas during some rough winter months. So the Europeans sort of realized, they need to look for other suppliers, and that's when this Qatar project came. And one reason that NATO countries, for example, these European countries in NATO want the terrorists to win in Syria, or they're insisting on the toppling of President Assad, is because President Assad set his foot down and said this pipeline is not going through our country. The Qatari-Turkish pipeline is not going to go through Syria. So this whole thing, the foundation of this whole conflict is energy. Something, a very interesting quotation that 18th and 19th century German military theorist and strategist General Karl von Clausewitz said, that I have my own extension to that quotation. And this is a quotation that you should just either write it down or really have it sink in here. This ties in with what I'm saying. He said, war is an extension of politics by other means. Think about that. War is an extension of politics by other means. And since my specialty is international political economy, I have an extension to von Clausewitz's brilliant quotation, and I say politics is an extension of economics by other means. Therefore, we can say war is almost always an extension of economics. And this is demonstrating itself tragically in Syria. The foundation of this conflict is not geosectarianism. It's not about human rights, all this BS that the West has been saying all these years, these past 6 years, that they've been imposing this horrible war on Syria. It's economics. It's getting that natural gas into the European market so they will be less reliant on Russia. That's why Russia has a card in this. That's why Russia wants, for example, we could always reason that the Russians want this Islamic pipe between Iran and Lebanon to be built, even though they're going to be competing with that because they will have to share the European markets. But they see a much grander strategy than this, than just short-term economics. They want to make those countries regular allies in the Middle East. I'm talking about Syria, even Iraq, and obviously Iran, who has been a very stable partner of Russia. They want to make this permanent, and they want to make sure natural gas or the export of natural gas to Europe is the foundation of this. So that's really what's behind this. War is an extension of politics by other means. One class with Azadgan says politics is an extension of economics by other means. So when we combine these two quotations, these two schools of thoughts, then we can say, if you add, one Clausewitz's quote and my quote, then you can deduce that politics is an extension of economics. That's my part. Then we can always say, therefore, war is always an extension of not just politics, by economics by other means. And every war in human history, I'm willing to sit down and debate anyone, any of my peers, any of my fellow professors, that any war in history always had its foundation in economics. Any war. Okay, the first recorded war at least in Western civilization or Western mythology is what? You all know it. There's been movies made about this. It's the Trojan Wars, right? It's the wars between the Greek city-states, right? Athens was one of them. Certainly you had Sparta, which was a very warmongering, harsh city-state in the Greek Confederation. And then you had the city of Troy, right? In the Anatolian Peninsula, which is now Turkey. And that's where the word Turkey is derived from, the word Troy to some extent. If you do an etymological study of that, it was a very rich city and had nothing to do with getting Helen back, sending her back to Sparta to her husband, who was the brother of none other than the King of Kings, Agamemnon. Those of you who watched that Brad Pitt movie, you can identify with what I'm saying. It had nothing to do with any of that. It had nothing to do with the woman, had nothing to do with love. It had everything to do with using Helen of Troy as a pretext in order to, conquer Troy. Troy was in the middle of the way. They were sort of located, geostrategically and geopolitically. They were right in a very strategic part. And from there, all the trade from Far East, including Persia and China and India, went through this city. And then from there, it got spread to the rest of Europe. So Agamemnon, the King of Kings, as the Greeks basically plagiarized that term from the Persians, Agamemnon really was after that economic route. Now, the thing is, that doesn't exactly make a interesting, it doesn't make it romantic, in mythology or in history. So mythology and history teach us that it was over the love of Paris, right? This prince Paris from Troy, the love that he had for Princess or Helen over there in Sparta, and then they had some kind of a meeting and they stole her, blah blah blah. That sounds so much more romantic and more interesting for history books. But the truth is, it's about economics, and of course nobody would fight. Nobody. I'm talking about the common man. The common man wouldn't fight for economic interest. They really don't. I mean, the people at the top, that top 1%, or the 80-20 rule, the 20% of the population controls the bottom 80%. That's like the most democratic version of it, okay? In reality, it's actually the 199%. 1% has economic interest. They will use social causes. They will use romantic, ideological causes in order to recruit people to go and fight their dirty wars. And so I have this disagreement with some of my colleagues that, don't narrow down everything to economics. I'm sorry, everything does come down to macroeconomics and international political economy. But the masses wouldn't be motivated. They wouldn't get motivated to just, fight for economic gain. So the 1% elite uses ideology and religion and geosectarianism and patriotism and nationalism. They will use these very abstract concepts in order to get people to actually fight. And that's always been the case through human history. And unless we evolve or be on the path of evolution, sociological, psychological, and ideological evolution, then we're going to keep repeating the same history. And the children of the poor are going to be recruited into the army, and they're going to be used to fight for the economic gain of the 1%. In this case, the 13 families, Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, all these evil 13 families that are currently ruling the world. So let me go ahead and stop here. Stand by for the next video. In the next video, we're going to talk about the top 10 natural gas producers in the world. I will go into detail as far as their share. And then after that video, we will go into answering question number 2 and question number 3 of our student over there in Australia. So please stand by, and thank you for your attention span throughout these past 20 minutes. Stand by for part 2, 3, and possibly part 4. Okay, thank you for your interest. Thank you for watching part 2 of this production. In part 2, we want to talk about the top 10 natural gas producer nations in the world. We want to talk about basically the amount of cubic meter of natural gas that they're exporting, okay, and these numbers come from the International Energy Agency, okay? That's our bibliography there. These are very solid numbers. They go back to 2013. So about 4 years ago, that's the last time we had these figures. The new figures we're hoping would come out very shortly. But we have to cite those figures, and it really hasn't changed. The market share of these countries hasn't changed. So let's talk about the top 10 natural gas producers in the world when it comes to nations. The first country, the biggest producer, let me just go ahead and name all the 10, then I'll go into the details. So the top 5 are US, Russia, Qatar, again, Qatar is in the news, Iran, and Canada. These are the top 5 producers as of now. Again, the first one is US, obviously, and I'll go into detail. It's how much cubic meters we export, or at least how much we have, and our share of that, and then I will go into other 10 countries. So it's US number 1, we're number 1, and then Russia, Qatar, Iran, right, where I was born, and Canada. And then number 6 is China, followed by Norway, number 7, and then Netherlands, number 8. Saudi Arabia is actually number 9 when it comes to natural gas. They're number 1 or number 2 when it comes to petroleum, right? But when it comes to natural gas, they're all the way number 9. And then Algeria is number 10. So let's go over it again. US, Russia, Qatar, Iran, Canada, China, Norway, Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, and then Algeria. These are the top 10 natural gas producers in the world. US is recorded by, again, my source is International Energy Agency, the top rated the body of controlling who's got how much. These are highly scientific numbers. The U.S. has, at the moment, the estimate is around 690 billion cubic meters. That's about 20% of the world market share, or the world supply of natural gas is in U.S. territory, whether it's in territorial waters or actually underground. Whether it's in the bottom 49, the bottom 48 states or in Alaska. So 20%, 1/5 of the natural gas supply in the world belongs to the U.S. Very sizable, isn't it? And then Russia is at the second. They have 671 billion cubic meters, and their market share is about 19%. I rounded it up. US is actually 19.8, so we can round it up to 20%. Russia about 19%, one less. In other words, the competition is incredible between US and Russia, especially if the Russians decide to excavate all the natural gas in the North Pole, which they claim, right? And this is a huge source of contention. The Russians believe they have rights to all those waters, and of course, because of global warming, all that ice is melting, and the energy companies love that because when you have an ice layer over land, then if you drill, because the ice is moving, that drill the next day could be quite a few meters away, whereas the actual excavation is literally right beneath it. That's why oil companies love climate change. That's why they want to do everything to make sure climate change does happen, because they are so short-sighted, and all they think of is excavating that natural gas or oil. And when you have an ice layer, that cannot happen unless the ice actually melts and it becomes either the ocean water, or in some cases, the whole island could pop up if it melts enough and the water disperses, and then they could drill right into the ground. Of course, that is not the case when it comes to North Pole. It's all going to be under water, and when there's no ice, unfortunately, oil companies see that as a gain, unless we, really seriously start shifting to clean energy. So Russia, 19%, US 20%, very, very close. Qatar, this tiny little, mosquito of a nation. It's actually a peninsula if you look in the Persian Gulf, in the southern Persian Gulf. They have 161 billion cubic meters. Now, we went from 20% and 19%, United States and Russian share. With Qatar, we go to 4.5%, and to be precise, 4.6%. Okay, but it's absolutely mind-boggling that this tiny little nation is actually number 3 when it comes to natural gas reserves, and then Iran is at the same exact level as Qatar. Interestingly, the Qatari supply or the Qatari reserve is estimated at 161 billion cubic meters. The Iranians are estimated at 159 cubic meters. So if anything, you would think there would be a lot of contention and competition between the Qataris and the Iranians. It just happens to be that the Qataris are sick and tired of being under the Saudi yoke. They realize their tremendous energy potential. They realize that the future is the natural gas until we transition into clean energy. And that's why the Saudis, are feeling extremely threatened by the Qataris. And Qatar is realizing they should ally themselves more with Iran and Russia, very interestingly, especially the Iranian part. Because up to now, Qatar has been, diametrically opposed to what Iran is doing in Iraq and Syria, and Qatar has been on the side of the Saudis in supporting these savages in order to create the hostility and a perpetual war in Syria, so they could topple Bashar al-Assad. This was the Qatari plan. This was the Saudi, Qatari, Turkish plan. The Turks and the Qataris are realizing they cannot win this war because President Assad is standing very firm, and his allies are standing very firm. So they're realizing they can't topple this guy. They can't topple this guy, and so that they're feeling very threatened by the whole thing. Now, it's not a coincidence that the Turks are supplying a lot of food and actually military attaches and what have you to the Qataris right now. This is really, really interesting. They may think, okay, this is again forecasting what I'm about to go into. Excuse me. The Qataris are thinking that they could possibly bring in the Iraqis on their side. In other words, instead of the pipeline going through Saudi Arabia, the Qatari pipeline could go to Kuwait, right through Iraq, into Turkey, into Europe. That's why the Turks are kind of joining the Qatari bandwagon right now. It's, again, all about energy. It has nothing to do with geosectarianism. Obviously, as you are my viewers, you're very intelligent. It has nothing to do with human rights or Bashar al-Assad being a dictator. I mean, it's ridiculous, It's all these dictatorships, these Arab dictatorships, pointing their finger at a secular government of Syria, and of course it's a dictatorship. Find me one government in the Middle East that's not a dictatorship, really, except for Iran and Israel, to some extent. But so the Turks are sort of banking on that one right now. They're realizing the pipeline cannot go through Syria, which the Turks really had a very corrosive role in spreading anarchy. They want the pipeline. They're thinking, they're forecasting. Nobody knows really that maybe that pipeline would go through Iraq if the Iraqis jump their bandwagon, and if the Iraqis actually decide to renege on the wars with the Iranians and with their Syrians and their Lebanese brothers and decide to partner with the Turks and Qataris. So this is a major source of contention that could come in the future. However, the Turks and the Iranians have historically they've had a cordial relationships. The Turkish-Iranian relationship, has been nothing. It's never been as turbulent as the Iranian, Arab relationship, especially when it comes to Saudi Arabia. So we don't know. Maybe the Iranians and the Turks and the Qataris have their own plan. Maybe the pipeline would go through Iran. Maybe part of it would go through Iran, part of it will go through Iraq and into Turkey. At this point, everything is liquid. We are still monitoring what's happening. All we know is that the Saudis are being marginalized. This we know. Even after $110 billion sale, to the U.S. Weapon deal with Saudi Arabia, we don't see that as anything to worry about. And I had this other question from a student in Iran. This question was obviously sent to me in Persian, and then her concern was that, Professor, wouldn't the $110 billion weapon sale, I'm translating right now, from United States to Saudi Arabia, and the formation of Arab disability to some extent, Arab loss in Syria. Don't you think this would get us closer to war? The Iranians are obviously seeing the Saudis as a major source of instability and a state sponsor of terrorism. Of course, the Saudis manipulate that and throw that back at the Iranians. Everybody knows who the biggest state sponsor of terrorism is in the region. It's none other than Saudi Arabia. Even the Israelis don't come close to that. They're the biggest state sponsor of terrorism against the Palestinians, but Saudi Arabia, they've got their hand in every evil thing, any evil terroristic organization or plan or movement across the Middle East. I mean, we're talking about from Philippines all the way to Morocco, Nigeria, for crying out loud. So, what was I saying? So basically, that's a very interesting. The reserves for Qatar and Iran are very, very close. And these figures, by the way, are psychological figures, especially the Qatar and Iran part. 161 billion cubic meters for the Qataris, 159 cubic meters for the Iranians. Very, very interesting. But they're both at 4.6% when it comes to the actual supply ownership. Then at number 5, interestingly, we have Canada, which holds a 4.5% share of all the natural gas in the world. Okay, I'm just going to go with the percentages now. I don't want to confuse you too much with the billion cubic meter figure. Then China has about 3.3%. Norway has 3.1% at number 7. Number 8, who would have thought? Netherlands. Netherlands actually has 2.5% of natural gas. That's quite interesting. Saudi Arabia has 2.4, so literally 0.1% less than Netherlands at 2.4% of all the natural gas in the world, and then Algeria is at 2.3. So basically, the two tiers, Russia and the U.S. that have about 20%, those two nations together basically comprise 40% of all the natural gas in the world, and the other 60% is shared, at least in the top 10 countries that I gave you. Those are, we go from 19 or 20% figure all the way down to Iran and Qatar, which are at 4.6% figure. So anyway, let's stop this video here. Oh, and the answer to that question, I got to answer the question of our Iranian student who sent this question to me a couple of weeks back. No, I don't think there will be a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Ultimately, what we are not just wishing or hoping, what we are forecasting is that the cooler heads will prevail, even if it's one-sided. At the moment, there are really no cooler heads in Saudi Arabia, especially if you have this upstart so-called Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's the king's son. If he gets into power, he's a fanatic. He's a crazy hegemonist, but you still have cooler heads. You still have cool heads in Saudi Arabia. Prince Naif, who's actually the crown prince, he's of course old, and we all know that Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the son, he has aspirations to finish his own dad and get on the throne. But it's not as simple as that. The Saudi line of succession has always been from King Abdul Aziz, which was the grandfather or the godfather, if I want to call it that. These guys are criminals. Going back to 9 years ago. From that point on, basically, the line of succession was among akhwan, as they say in Arabic, among brothers. And these brothers were all the sons of King Abdul Aziz. So from that point on, when the king died, I think he died 1940s, 1950s, it were the brothers, right? The line of succession went from brother to brother, not from father to son. The only time it went from father to son was right when the King Abdul Aziz died, and he went to one of his sons, and then it got passed down. So the Saudis haven't had a model where a son of a king, King Salman's son, this Prince Mohammed, they haven't really had experience with this. And you're looking at 30,000 strong Saudi so-called royals. I use that term very judiciously and embarrassingly, because these savages shouldn't really be called princes or kings, but you have 30,000 Saudi royal members competing for power. And basically, I think Salman was the youngest brother, was the youngest son of Abdul Aziz, the king, the godfather, back from the back when KSA was actually established. So there were no more brothers. Now you got to keep in mind, why did they have all these long lineage of sons? It's because Saudis don't just marry one or two wives. They have so many that is just, out of control. They have 70 sons. The joke goes in Saudi Arabia that it's always the middle 40 that are crazy, and referring to bin Laden. But bin Laden came from a very affluent family. They're not royals. Their roots are from Yemen, but they have economically very well off. One of the richest families in Saudi Arabia, and had 80 children or something. It was some ridiculous number. I'm being facetious, but the joke is that it's always the middle 40 that are crazy, like Osama bin Laden. So same with King Abdul Aziz. The brothers are running out because there were so many boys, and now they have to go to the second generation of princes and kings. So this is a source of great contention within the Saudi internal politics. So this is the long answer to that student's question in Iran, is that I believe the internal feuds and internal situation in Saudi Arabia is going to be so sensitive after King Salman dies, hopefully soon. Maybe not hopefully soon, because we could have chaos in Saudi Arabia. The internal contention is going to be so bad and so chaotic that they may not even have the time or the willpower or the energy to attack Iran. And Iran hasn't attacked any country in 250 years. That record is as good as any Scandinavian country. And if you know anything about the United Nations, then you know that Scandinavian countries always brag about not having attacked anybody in 250 years. That figure is very symbolic, but it's also very factual. And these are the people who are Vikings, okay? As savage-like as you could think of. The ISIS and the Al-Qaeda of their time, minus the lunatic religious ideology. So there's hope. If these people were, thieves and pillagers and conquerors and savages of Europe, now they boast about not having attacked anybody in 250 years, and Iran has the same brilliant record. Now, if you watch this video and you're not familiar with the geopolitics of Middle East or Iran, you think this country has been in war, all these years. Yes, there were countries that attacked Iran repeatedly. The latest one was Iraq back in 1980, and that war went from 1980 to 1988. That was a horrible war. 1 million people died on each side. But Iran hasn't attacked any country, hasn't started a war in 250 years. Again, that record is as good as any Scandinavian country. So Iranians will not attack Saudi Arabia. If anything, Saudi Arabia would shoot the first cannon, and based on my forecast, that is not going to happen because there's tremendous amount of internal political disharmony in Saudi Arabia. No matter how many billions of dollars Washington sells weapons to this, to this backward-minded, misogynist country. So that's not a wishful thinking. Now, there could be skirmishes in Persian Gulf, okay? There could be intrusion of foreigners, and by that I'm talking about Washington and NATO in Persian Gulf. They're trying to motivate another, Muslim versus Muslim country, which is exactly what they did between Iran and Iraq in those 8 years. They wanted these two countries to neutralize themselves, to destroy themselves in that horrible war, which was very reminiscent of World War I, because it was trench warfare, and even chemical weapons were used by the Iraqis. That was the big new Brzezinski thesis. Just have them kill each other off. Let's not intervene. Let's just have them kill each other off and just have each other go bankrupt. We're hoping that the second and third generation after that horrible war have learned. King Abdullah, the one before this one, before King Salman, he pledged even to the Iranians that he would never again was his phrase, will the Iran-Iraq scenario would happen. And I think he was talking about his country waging war against the Iranians, or the Iranians attacking them. They reached some kind of a consensus under the Khatami administration, and even going back to President Rafsanjani, who recently died. These are the founders of the Islamic Republic concept in Iran. Rafsanjani still, his daughters and his clan, his family, still have cordial relations with the Saudis, or the old generation of Saudis. So at that time, they reached an understanding that Saudi Arabia and Iran would never go into war. So again, to answer that student's question is, we are forecasting in the short term that there won't be a war between these superpowers in the region. Saudi Arabia and Iran, we don't really consider a nation that's only been in existence for 90 years a superpower. A nation of savages running around under camels or horses if they're lucky in the desert. You're looking at an Iranian civilization that goes back to literally 7,000 years ago. The past 2,500 years, Iran has been a world power with the Persian Empire, with Darius and Darius and then Cyrus and then Xerxes and all these great kings, which basically the world as we know it was divided between the Persians and the Romans, the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. So the Iranians are very even-handed. They have this tremendous history, and I'm not saying all this because I'm trying to praise the Iranians because I'm half Iranian myself. No, this just happens to be the truth. Iranians are very good in diplomacy. This whole Qatari mess is essentially Iranian diplomacy at its best. The Iranians defeated the Riyadh Declaration, which is the declaration that was signed during President Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia. The Iranians defeated that declaration without a shot being fired by anybody. That the Riyadh Declaration was essentially a war declaration against Iran. It just happened to be that some countries like Qatar, hopefully Kuwait, some of these countries in the GCC don't want that. They don't want to attack Iran because they're closer to Iran. Saudi Arabia is still, kind of further away. Whereas these countries like Qatar and Bahrain, Bahrain comes to mind, a very backward-minded country that the Saudis are practically considering one of their own provinces. Countries like Kuwait, countries like even UAE, which is right across the Strait of Hormuz, across Iran. They don't want the situation to get worsened because they're right across Iran, and they will feel the Iranian rage first before anybody. So that's why the best thing that's going to happen, and it is already happening again, the defeat of the Riyadh Declaration, which, as we said, is a really de facto declaration of war against Iran by Saudi Arabia and all these puppet states in Persian Gulf, that's coming apart. My forecast is there will be a lot of confusion and anarchy between these GCC countries, and Iran is going to sit back and they're going to basically have the last laugh. Even though the Iranians don't want an unstable Persian Gulf situation, they are motivating stability. They are just very shrewd. They're not going to let Saudi Arabia divide and conquer. This is the Saudi Arabia that has attacked Yemen for the past few years, literally destroyed this country with the help of these GCC countries, Gulf Cooperation Council, and a lot of those countries are fed up. They've seen their defeat in Syria, they're seeing their defeat in Yemen, even though they're completely obliterated, those two countries, when it comes to infrastructure, but they're realizing there's no future in this and they're losing. So you have this situation in GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, where they're coming apart. Thank God for that. They're coming apart. Their power to wage war is diminishing. At any rate, in the next videos, I believe it will be part 3 and 4, we're going to answer our wonderful student in Australia. We're going to answer her questions that she emailed to me, and I hope you're still staying with us and following part 4. So please stand by for part 3, and then we're going to cover those questions. Thank you.